Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, I'm live at Webster's in State College, Pennsylvania, joined by a familiar face, this time in the flesh, for a long-awaited conversation that's been in the works for maybe about a year now, maybe 3 years if you think about it.
Quite some time.
So with us is Tyrique Mack-Georges, who some of you may remember from an episode nearly 3.5 years ago, where we discussed his experiences as an undergraduate studying philosophy, but today Tyrique returns as a mature scholar, a mature scholar, as we would say, now thriving in the PhD program at Penn State, bringing with him a remarkable paper we'll be exploring together, Beyond Fulfillment, Fanon, Sartre, and the unfinished project of a new humanity. And we'll have Tyrique say a little bit more about that. But before we do that, Tyrique, why don't you give your own introduction, talk about your interests a little bit, and maybe why you're doing this particular paper.
Yeah, sure. So, as Craig said, I'm a graduate student at Penn State. I just finished my second year, which means I'm done coursework, and I'm getting more involved in where my research is going. So if I had to, briefly identify myself, I'd say I'm at the intersection of critical philosophy of race, continental philosophy, particularly 20th century continental philosophy, and Africana philosophy, and also similarly situated in the 20th century. And so, a lot of this paper explores some of those themes, and particularly issues regarding some of those themes in unison.
And so let's begin with your motivation for this particular paper. What drew you to the relationship between Sartre and Fanon generally, and why do you think that relationship has been mischaracterized in some of the scholarship that you're looking at?
So I want to say for maybe the last 10 or 15 years or so, there's been a real turn to Fanon's work, particularly I think, his early work, Lexion White Mass, and, renewed interest in the wretched of the earth. And a lot of it, as of late, has attempted to separate Fanon from Sartre, primarily because so much of the early scholarship relied on that, basically to kind of help canonize Fanon into, the Western philosophical canon, thinking about how he might relate to an established figure to kind of help him get a way through the door. And now that that's, already been done, a lot of scholars have kind of turned to thinking about him on his own terms. I think that's a great thing. I think people should be doing that. But I think it has also led to, as you were saying, an attempt to really distance Fanon from Sartre in ways that I don't think are, accurate to things that are textually evident or biographically evident. Mm-hmm. And as we'll talk more specifically with this text, very few people are writing on the relationship between the wretched of the earth and the critique of dialectical reason, which I find to be quite odd, mainly because, it's one of the texts that Fanon, if you read any biographies about him or read any of the correspondences he has with his editor, it's the one text that he seems to be really, really invested in his late life. He says, tell Sartre, like, every time I get down to write, I'm thinking about him. He was super excited to get to see Sartre when they finally met. And a lot of the questions revolved around this text. And so I think it's been a bit unfruitful that scholars have, not only neglected the relationship, but neglected the relationship with the critique of dialectical reason, which itself, has its own checkered history, being, a rather difficult text to read and get through.
And I think this is a good time on our podcast to revisit Sartre as not only a figure in philosophy, but French philosophy. For as much French philosophy as we do in Acid Horizon, we have never had an explicit episode on Sartre, nor Fanon, but I think we've talked about Fanon much more on the podcast. So maybe this is a way to revisit some of the concepts that are central to Sartre's work, particularly politically speaking, and the way they connect with Fanon's work. And so let's do that. What we want to develop for the viewer and the listener is a kind of lexicon right now of Sartre's conceptual terminology, and let's see how it might be useful to handling some of the problems that Fanon is dealing with. So in this paper, we discuss Sartre's idea of dialectical reason, and it plays a central role in your argument. And here we have the word dialectical, right? And so how would you define dialectical reason, and what makes it different from other ways of analyzing history or political change, like structuralism or analytical reason?
Right, yeah. So Sartre offers dialectical reason primarily as a supplement to analytical reason. And what he sees is this supplement is what will help us render systems a bit more intelligible. And so it might be useful to start with, what he wants to add. So analytic reason, to kind of put it broadly, approaches systems mainly by isolating phenomena and, studying them rigorously. And for Sartre, he sees this best captured in Engels' materialism, the neo-positivists of his day, and the Levi-Strausses of the time, right? And while there are real merits to that approach, what he thinks is lacking in those approaches are really two fundamental things, right? First, is situating those phenomenal occurrences within a broader historical narrative. And then the second, is the degree to which the existential subject, the one he really favors throughout all of his career, maintains, solidifies, or, to kind of borrow from the 18th Brumaire, changes that history. And so, and that's what he takes, the new rationality of dialectical reason to be doing, right? Primarily because, at a fundamental level, if we go back to Hegel, Marx, dialectical reason is trying to kind of dissolve oppositions between, theoretical analysis on the one hand and practical engagement on the other, towards something like what he's going to describe as praxis, which we can talk more about as well. And it's from that we can have a stronger account of not just systems, but systems like colonialism and racism, right? I can echo an example, and the advisor of mine, Robert Bernasconi, likes to talk about, which is, with this approach, we don't have to just simply comply with just bare bones sociological evidence about like police brutality, for instance, but we can situate that evidence within, the longer history of this country. By doing that, we show how the passive praxis of, police officers uphold that history, right? Giving us a sense, of, and at the same time, it also kind of gives us a sense, who want to respond to that, what kind of praxis would be necessary to overturn that. I think it's this form of reason that, is kind of so powerful for Sartre, and I think it's the kind of reason Fanon talks about as being necessary in, the wretched of the earth.
I mean, that's one of the things that stood out to me in your paper was, we often talk about the intersection of theory and praxis, right? And I think Sartre and Fanon realized this is really where the rubber meets the road, where, and this is a kind of crisis of our times, is, as they say, we have an abundance of theory and minimal praxis.
Yeah.
But the way that they see it is these theoretical interventions, in order to be vindicated, must erupt or occur as a kind of praxis that breaks the social order in some ways, right? And one of those concepts, or one of the concepts on the page in your paper that really pertains to that, is that concept of seriality.
Yeah.
And so how would you define Sartre's seriality, such an important concept? And could you offer an example, perhaps from colonialism or racist speech, as is brought up in the paper?
Let me run through some of my notes, see if I can... So I mentioned a moment ago the kind of passive praxis of the police officer. And in a basic sense, you could think about that at a larger level as kind of embodying what Sartre calls seriality. Essentially, for Sartre, seriality describes a kind of structure of an ensemble in which each individual are kind of defined by a kind of project of collective isolation, right? And, he has famous examples of this, like, the bus or, listening to the radio. The idea that he's noting there is that the people who are gathered in those gatherings are kind of bonded by their alterity, right? They understand themselves as separate through their kind of collective act of listening to the radio or waiting, right? This kind of passive or serial praxis, he says, is irrational. And part of the reason why he says it's irrational is that it's not a project that any person participating really grasps as their own. It's not something that they take to be their own, right? So, you line up and you get in the line for the bus, or, you turn on the knob and, you listen to the broadcast, but you're not doing that primarily because it's something that you're doing out of your own interest, but just as a thing that one does to participate in a particular system. And similarly, that's kind of how he understands racism, right? So he talks about how racists develop an identity through collective isolation. And they do that by, the kinds of things that they say, right? So they label the colonized in his example as, lazy, as thieves, as dirty, etc. And what he notes is that, none of the things that they say correspond to any project that belong to them, right? While what they say, do refer to, ideas. As serial ideas, they don't really reflect a kind of shared comprehension that they have, right? Instead, they're kind of forms of serial spoken praxis, which is to say, they uphold the system of colonialism, right? So in saying that the colonized is, lazy or whatever, you're not doing something, particularly new or, of your own, but you're kind of upholding a system that outstrips you. In the same way, when you line up to catch the bus, you're not really doing anything that belongs to a project that's yours, but upholding, a kind of transit system that's, right, been existing for a very long time. And the point there being is that, in the centuries after the establishment of colonialism, racist statements like this, they work to kind of link the contemporary racists today with the kind of, original racists who are kind of inaugurating that project, but at a kind of passive level. And so you can look at that and you can see how Fanon might find that, quite important. And I think it is quite important. It's the one part in The Wretched of the Earth that Fanon cites directly. And even later throughout the text, you kind of see him developing it further and even kind of adding the perspective of the colonized in there, right? So he talks about this research that was being done during the time of French occupation in Algeria, where colonial psychologists like Anton Perrault and others, were putting together kind of sociological, psychological evidence to show that North Africans are, savages, right, robbers, killers, etc. And all of those claims, they align rather conveniently right, with the interests of French colonialism. And, when he critiques it, he says something that I think, is particularly Sartrean. He says, all these elements focalize on Algerian criminality appeared evident to support a form of systematization. And that's the kind of term, I was just describing earlier when we were talking about what makes dialectical reason specific is that it kind of makes systems intelligible. And so for him, in other words, just like what Sartre was just saying, the colonists, the results that came from this research weren't really about a scientific project oriented towards new results, towards thinking about what psychology looks like, but a kind of predetermined result, the kind of projects already written for Perrault and the gang. And it's a predetermined result that's determined by a kind of serial, upholding of colonialism. And the thing he says then is that, not only does it do the same thing Sartre was saying, racist speech does, but this kind of, collective object of, this research also does this to the colonized, right? Because for the colonized, the more they kind of identify with this particular form of psychology, the less likely they are to kind of unite together and oppose the system of colonialism, and the more likely they are to kind of be isolated and alienated. In the same way, the colonialists are collectively together, but are fundamentally alienated in the sense that, it's not a shared project.
I'd actually like to drill down on this concept of seriality a little bit
Sure.
more, because I think this is one of the most important ideas that Sartre puts forward. One of my first encounters with Sartre, and like reading his biography, he comes across as somebody who's particularly ferocious in terms of his relationship to philosophy and the way that he orients himself to his philosophical project as a lifestyle. I mean, clearly he set out to be a standout philosopher in his era, but not only that, we just know about his incredible writing habits, like 25 pages a day at the cafe and that sort of thing. So clearly he has a vested interest in extricating himself from the compulsions of the time. And that seems to be a lot of what seriality is about. Now, given this concept, how do you see seriality functioning today with respect to social media or things like dating apps even, right?
Yeah, so I mean, you could think, I kind of went through it a bit quickly, but I could kind of return to the radio example. He has, I think it really has two forms of seriality. One would be the direct gathering. So the bus example is a direct gathering where, we all line up and, I'm next to you, you're next to me. But fundamentally, we're really existing in a collective isolation. for this project to take place, we all need to be together, but we don't really need to share any project. So that's the kind of direct gathering. Indirect gathering describes what he talks about with the radio, right? So in the radio, I'm in my car, you're in your car, and we're driving around, and I turn on this particular broadcast, and the person speaking to me, they kind of speak to me indirectly, right? They're not really speaking to me as Tyrique or you as Craig, but me as listener and you as listener. And so in that way, we're linked, but we're linked insofar as we're also isolated.
Well, this is a good time to say we are talking to you here at Acid Horizon. Please support the podcast. Anyway, no, continue.
No, but yeah, I think so I would say much of social media is a form of an indirect gathering, which is to say, if you could think about just kind of even how a lot of things are structured. So when you get on social media, you make a post, unless you're adding someone or, speaking to someone directly. And even there might be some serial things we could discuss. But for the most part, if you're just kind of posting, the post is not really directed at a person. It's kind of directed at anyone who can see it. But the reason why it even has any kind of, meaning for us, and the way we kind of evaluate those meanings through, the shares, the likes, the sends.
Sure. Yeah.
Those things indicate that, there are other people there kind of keeping this thing alive, right? So, there might be a certain amount of likes on a tweet that I put out. And every person who likes my tweet is, in a sense, kind of serially connected, right? In the sense that, you like this tweet, I like this tweet, we all kind of like this same tweet. And, the tweet has a meaning for all of us insofar as, none of us actually ever see each other to talk about what's happening here, right? I mean, I guess, again, things get a little bit different when we talk about like comment sections, but, for the most part, the way things are presented, it's rather serial. And then, I think dating apps are another interesting example because, again, yeah, like and this is something, someone who I like to think a lot in relation to Sartre, someone like Erich Fromm describes in The Art of Loving. Dating apps, fundamentally are an example of what Fromm calls the kind of putting oneself on the personality market. And by that, he basically means the same thing we see. You list a certain amount of things you want, or a certain amount of things you're looking for, a certain kind of appearance. But it's not, everyone is on there and everyone's kind of sending likes in that same way I was just describing. But, it's kind of characterized by us kind of being fundamentally isolated from each other. And I think that's part of the reason why even when a match does happen on dating apps, it's hard for those things to really sustain themselves because the presentation is so serial. The presentation is so serial, and that when it's actually time for, a kind of reciprocity to start happening, then, it kind of starts to tinker out.
That makes sense. I'm just thinking about right now how a tweet is almost like cramming your inner monologue into a dirty bomb and just throwing it out into the public sphere.
Basically.
Well, let's talk about the more revolutionary dimension of Sartre and Fanon, particularly this concept of group infusion. Sartre is a huge influence on Felix Guattari.
Yes.
And this concept really edges up against the notion of subject group that we see there. But how does a group infusion emerge out of a serial condition? And why is it such a compelling model for understanding how revolutionary groups form in Fanon's thinking?
Right. So, so I said a moment ago, serial praxis reflects, human actions subordinated to, material ends, right? So in the bus example, us lining up is subordinated to the, material system of the bus, right? Or the radio or social media. Our ends as a kind of collective are fundamentally determined by the material. And, we talked a little bit ago about racism. It's a similar kind of thing, right? Where the act of saying certain things in the case of the colonialist or producing certain research in the case of Anton Perot, those things are in service to the material system of colonialism. So that's what serial praxis is. So serial praxis is about how human actions are passively subordinated to material ends. Then what I really take group praxis to be doing is human actions actively or reoriented towards human ends, right? So, it's about recognizing, the limitations of a particular material system, and kind of as a ensemble, as a kind of, collective grouping, coming to negate that particular thing. I mean, one thing that's important to kind of remember with respect to Praxis, which I wanted to spell out a little bit further, was that, with Praxis, the idea there is also that, we negate what's materially given to kind of bring forth something that doesn't yet exist, right? And that bringing forth should kind of sound familiar to the kind of Heideggerians, and it's in the sense that, what's fundamentally driving this thing is a notion of a project in that Heideggerian sense, right? That, there's a project to which, there's a kind of positive project to which the kind of negative nihilation of Praxis aims, right? And so when the colonized as a kind of ensemble come to see the limitations of this colonial system, what kind of becomes more apparent is the project of collective liberation. And that details or prefigures what kind of praxis will be necessary to bring that about. And, what I think is super important for both Sartre and Fanon, and this again goes back to what I was saying is specific about dialectical reason, is that what it does is it's also about how subjects are producing history in that, Marx 18th Brumaire sense. In the idea that, and Sartre talks about this, it's one of my favorite lines in the critique. He talks about the guy who says to the Bastille, and they all run to the Bastille. And one of the things he says is that, in that moment, those participants in the group infusion who are kind of resisting the kind of practical inert system, they're inaugurating what he calls new realities, right? They're kind of, history itself is kind of revealing new realities that once weren't possible due to being subordinated to those older ends. That's the same kind of thing Fanon sees, taking that French Revolution example to kind of think about, what, decolonization actually looks like. Decolonization would mean, the production of a new history, perhaps for the first time for these people, right? Rather than being subordinated to the colonial system that dictate how they should behave, as a group, they come to negate that system. And in doing so, understand it. And that's, understand the kind of violence that sustained it, understand the violence that's maintained it, and use that same tool to produce something brand new. In that way, history is kind of revealing something brand new.
And perhaps this is where the concept of, or Fanon's concept of new humanity comes in.
Yeah.
And in your paper, you spend some time with a pivotal 1959 speech by Fanon that he delivers in a context of Pan-African intellectual and cultural exchange. And why is that moment important for understanding how he first begins to articulate this idea of his positive project, which is the new humanity?
Yeah. So I think, so if, for readers of Fanon would know, the idea of the new humanity, it's throughout most of his major work. So, one of the first things he, mentions in the Black Skin, White Mask is striving towards a new humanism. He ends Black Skin, White Mask kind of driving towards this as well. In his first speech to, the Congress of Negro Writers and Artists, which has been collected as Racism and Culture. He talks a bit about it there. And in other texts, he talks about it. This second one, and I think the second one is important because it's in this second one where you really see him prefiguring the kind of things Sartre's going to talk about. So he talks about how, the colonized need a form of thinking that allow them to not recognize themselves as dislocated. Because what he sees, he says this explicitly, the colonial system does the job of, ossifying, dislocating disparate members of the population such that it can continue to do its own thing. And what he sees the new humanity as being able to do is kind of prefigure in the acts, in the acts of kind of working against that, what steps will be necessary to bring those people together.
Gotcha.
And the kind of argument that I make is that I think, he has this concept of the new human that he's had for quite a long time. But it's really it's through the critique and through some of the things we've been discussing thus far, Praxis, project, dialectical reason, group series, etc., where he really gets a kind of lexicon that we're, been trying to build here too, to think about what it would mean to bring that new humanity about, right? What it would mean for new directions for history to emerge. In the Second Congress of Negro Writers, in the speech that he gives there, he talks about this new humanism as kind of prefiguring what kind of praxis is necessary. And what we get attached in The Wretched of the Earth is that speech in relation to, kind of how far he's come, the distance he's traveled after he's spent time really reading the critique and thinking through some of the terms.
Well, of course, Fanon is carrying Sartre and Sartre's work in the development of his own work. But one of the interesting things that you suggest, and I mean, it's just a historical fact, is that Fanon's work then impacts the way that Sartre is writing. Unless we've delved into this work, we might not think of Fanon and Sartre in those terms. But in what respect did Fanon actually influence Sartre?
Yeah. So there are two ways, I would say. So one of the arguments that my advisor, Bernasconi, put forward, which I don't think he agrees with anymore. We've talked about this, but one of the arguments he put forward in, one of the papers he first wrote on this relationship between Sartre and Fanon is that one of the ways you kind of see it coming through is that Sartre kind of shelves the second volume of the critique, primarily because he sees Fanon as kind of already doing what he really wanted the book to be, the project of the critique to be doing, which is thinking about how, history can change. And particularly thinking about how subjects can make history change. That's one particular side. And even then, if you read the second volume of the critique for what it's worth, because it's a bit even more unwieldy than the first volume, because it was not even complete or prepared for publication. But there are moments where Sartre himself has footnotes. Well, he has one particular footnote to Fanon, and it's particularly this idea of, what violence looks like, how it's played out, and how, when the colonized don't have the intelligibility of the colonial system intact, they kind of lead to a kind of expelling of violence towards each other and whatnot. He's kind of thinking in lockstep, like how Fanon's putting some of his ideas to work. But I think the one where you really see this kind of coming out is in the second lecture he gives to the Gramsci Institute. So he gives one lecture to the Gramsci Institute, I believe in 1963, and that is kind of compiled under the text, What is Subjectivity? He comes back the next year in 64 and gives a different lecture under the title, in French, the French translation is The Roots of Ethics. And in The Roots of Ethics, he's at the Gramsci Institute, so he's talking to Marxists. And at the time, the people who are, on the scene are people like Althusser and, the structuralist Marxists, neo-positivists, etc. And his concern really is that, their kind of account of things, because it's, decentered the subject, and in a certain sense, kind of decentered the way in which history moves. In doing so, they've done what he calls putting ethics on holiday, right? That's the language he uses. And, he thinks that, a proper orientation to the human and a proper orientation to a kind of new humanism is really what's going to allow Marxism to return really to its roots, right? To return to some of the things, I was gesturing about with the 18th Brumaire and other texts, where it is about how human beings kind of smash systems, and he even goes as far as to say, and I think a lot of this kind of comes out of a disillusionment with the USSR and particularly, a seeming anarchist leaning that he starts to develop. He says smashing even socialist systems as they exist now, right? And kind of producing, a system in which, well, not even really a system, producing a manner in which we exist in reciprocity with each other.
So in recent months, in a space we both share, we've heard a controversial take that we should put down Fanon and pick up Marx, with the implication that Marx offers a more rigorous or useful theoretical foundation for revolutionary politics. And setting aside any obvious dog whistles in that claim, I wanted to ask you a somewhat different question.
Sure.
What does Fanon offer that an engagement with Marx alone simply does not provide?
So, I mean, there's the famous line in the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth where he describes what he's doing is not doing away with Marxism, but stretching it. Fundamentally, that's, kind of where my stakes are in this particular question, which is that, I think Marxism itself has to be something that's always being stretched. I think Marx wanted Marxism to be something that's always being stretched. And in doing so, by stretching it, you have to account for the kinds of things Marx just couldn't account for. Fundamentally, Marx is thinking about not just the proletariat as such, but a kind of Western proletariat, because that's just where he is. That's his context, and he wants to think about the revolutionary possibilities capable to that context. For those living outside of that context, and so long as we all understand capitalism to kind of be the thing in which is currently the thing subordinating our ends in that serial way. If Marxism is a real tool for thinking about change, it can't just be beholden to a particular space. It has to be able to account for these other spaces, right? And I think that's the kind of thing that Fanon and others, like people that come to mind, Walter Rodney in particular, are really key on, which is that Marx gives us a kind of blueprint to think about the form in which capitalism dominates us in all kinds of different regions, the colonial context, racial contexts, proletarian contexts, etc. And none of those things, to me, none of those things need to be separated, right? And in that kind of way, I was just kind of describing seriality in groups. I kind of see this as a kind of real attempt to be what we really should be doing is trying to get a kind of group infusion effort going, rather than isolating ourselves and kind of producing a kind of serial praxis that's subordinated to the ends of a particular author or the ends of a particular ideological system.
Yeah, I mean, even theory can be an apparatus by which we are serialized,
Yeah,
right?
100%.
And we see it every day.
Yeah.
Well, with that said, first of all, congratulations on completing your coursework.
Thank you.
So what's next for you in terms of the PhD? What do you think you're going to focus on?
So, I mean, I think, a lot of the things we've discussed here are going to be central to, where things are going. But I will, soon I'll be, giving a talk for the Sartre Society on some of these ideas, particularly what we discussed a moment ago with respect to racist speech, serialization, and, how a group emerges out of that. That's something I'm going to spend a bit more time, hopefully this summer, getting ready to, prepare to speak for. So that's one direction. The other direction is, again, I think, and this is really united with where I want the thing to be situated, which is thinking about how these things can answer questions that we have, right? And so, at the beginning, I talked about how this can furnish a kind of more rigorous analysis of stuff like systemic racism or colonialism. And, I think that's a particular direction I really want this project to be going. Sartre, Fanon, for them, that's really about, colonialism as it existed toward the turn of the Second World War. But, other accounts of systemic racism look different. And I think, but I still think there are tons of resources in these texts that kind of give us a sense to think through that. I had that example of police brutality and whatnot. But you can also think about this in terms of, just kind of where we're at today. So much of our accounts of, racism, I think, really fall on what I would really call two ends, right? So on the one end, there is, again, I think this kind of structuralist approach that's kind of concerned with, rightly concerned with how it is that things like laws, infrastructure, all these other things produce, a structure that reinforce and reproduce, racism. That's kind of one side, I think, that, scholarship, academics, philosophy, et cetera, has been investigating. But the other side, then, I think, is this, concern with intention, and even, some branches of phenomenology, I think, fall into this trap, which is thinking about racism purely from the perspective of, the kinds of intentions and the kind of intentions that are embodied in certain habits, right? Again, really important work. But I think what the two miss is that, they kind of need to be together. And that's kind of what I see this work, kind of see the work that Sartre and Fanon is doing, which is thinking about how, lived experience and the kind of things that are reproduced from that are fundamentally structured by things, right? But those things are things. We can't hold laws or infrastructures accountable. We can hold people accountable,
right?
And in holding people accountable, we're not just kind of holding them accountable for the isolated liberal atomistic intentions that they have. We're holding them accountable for passively participating in a historical process of discrimination, right? And you're putting you're kind of putting the challenge back in front of them. Like, now that you've seen what you're upholding, do you still want to uphold it? Are you willing to kind of take the steps necessary to turn towards a praxis that would actually be producing something new, and perhaps be producing something that isn't serial and authentically your own, something that you share, right? And I think that's the real potency of calling it a new humanity, right? It's something that as individuals, as human beings, is something we can come to the table and try to understand together and bring together.
Sounds like an uncomfortable process.
Yeah.
But if we can push past the shame, that's where the transformation lies, right?
Sure. I mean, and it does. I think I put the emphasis a bit on a lot of the aggressors, but you can think about this from the other side too, insofar as and I think this is the thing Fanon was critiquing, as I was saying a moment ago, with respect to the North Africans who hear those thoughts being circulated and kind of come to identify with them. Don't want to be seen as a savage, don't want to be seen as a killer, and so they don't do what's necessary to produce a group that's going to change history, right? And you can think about that in all kinds of different contexts. The worker who crosses a picket line, or examples like that. So it's not purely on the aggressors who uphold those systems, because it's not just the aggressive folks who uphold those systems. All of us who kind of participate in things uphold those systems, and I think that's the real uncomfortability, right? But I think if we can really wrestle with that and think about what it would take to make that system intelligible, and come to say, like, is this something we want to continue to uphold? I think really interesting things can happen.
Great. Well, what's going to be very cool is I think in the spring we'll be working together again doing the Marx and Phenomenology seminar with Nicholas de Warren. Yeah. So we'll probably have videos for that sometime soon. Yep. And I'll just say, for folks listening or watching this right now, if you enjoy this kind of interview, we can do more of them. And like, for example, all the technology that you see here, these things are supported by our patrons. So please subscribe to Acid Horizon at any level. And Tyrique, I just want to thank you, and good luck, and have a great rest of your summer.
Thank you.